All right, today we are going to be looking at the goal, the telos of Lacanian psychoanalysis, and we're going to put it in dialogue with the goal or telos of the Orthodox perspective on salvation. We're going to look at a quote and do a little bit of a close reading here, and I'm going to be defining some terms in this context as we come across them. So whether you're familiar with Lacan or not, I'm going to try to make this kind of more general. So thanks for checking it out, and I'd love to hear what you think. And please, I have a Patreon now. Please feel free at the $5 level. You can get access to these videos early. I'm going to be doing some content just for Patreon. I'm also going to be putting together a monthly what is symbolism and why it matters and how can we apply it in our lives monthly reading group where we're going to be discussing kind of current events through the symbolic lens. But for this video, let's get right into it here. So the term that right off the bat we're going to come across is castration and the fundamental fantasy from a Lacanian perspective. The term castration is a kind of a psychological term that happens early on in childhood when the child, let's say for argument's sake, is a boy, has to sacrifice some of its desire for its mother in order to please the father and take on the name of the father, take on the qualities of the father. And this process causes a lot of turmoil and trouble that follows the child through into adulthood. During this process that also encompasses during the mirror stage of early childhood development, through the development of the ego, which Lacan says is the symptom par excellence, the person develops a fundamental fantasy, which is kind of their worldview from my perspective in a fallen world. The fundamental fantasy is the story, the narrative that we tell ourselves and about our situation in our lives. So here's the quote that really stood out to me that I want to look at here. Quote from Lacan. Again, this is in terms of the goal of analysis. So what the neurotic does not want, and what he strenuously refuses to do right up until the end of his analysis, is to sacrifice his castration to the other's jouissance, allowing it to serve the other. Now, I'm just going to flip some terms around here to make it from an orthodox perspective here. What the sinner does not want, and what he strenuously refuses to do right up until the end of his repentance, is to sacrifice his intellect for the grace of God, allowing it to serve the other, his neighbor. And let's get in a little bit to the text here and dig in a little bit here. So Lacan's notion of the fundamental, I'm reading from A Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Theory and Technique from Bruce Fink. So I've been reading a lot from the first Fink book, which is entitled The Lacanian Subject. And like orthodoxy, Lacanian psychoanalysis is wedded in theory and praxis. Taking one without the other necessarily gives you an incomplete view. So I think there's some interesting correlations here. And again, we're not looking to conflate these ideas. We're looking to put them in dialogue and see what emerges here. Just some stuff that I have on my notes from reading this, right? What analysis is doing, attempting to do from an orthodox perspective is a transformation, a reorientation, a transfiguration of sacrifice, of this implicit sacrifice that is made in early childhood that instantiates us into the symbolic order and puts us under the sway of the law, of the other, of society. This is the root of the neuroses, psychosis, and the perversion that makes up the personality type from a psychoanalytic perspective. So from the text here, Lacan's notion of the fundamental fantasy encompasses two complex facets of Freud's theory. His early stress on the quote-unquote sexual overload at the origin of neurosis, but also his later stress on a loss of sexual pleasure. The term jouissance, which we've come across here, means it's like an orgasm. It's a small death. It's getting your rocks off. It's getting temporary satisfaction that's implicitly ripe with pain. So it's a satisfaction that cannot be met, that continuously is attempted to be met. And this is where the neurosis and the personality disorders are rooted from a Lacanian perspective here. In the course of a child's quote-unquote education, Lacan writes here, or Fink writes, its parents impose many sacrifices. Immediate gratification of the need to eat and excrete is withheld or punished. And autoerotic behavior is progressively discouraged. Thumb sucking, at first tolerated, is eventually discouraged or even punished. Touching one's genitals in public, while perhaps allowed the infant, is forbidden the school child, and so on. It is this loss of gratification, whether autoerotic or alloerotic, involving another person, such as the mother, that Lacan refers to as castration. So this initial prohibition from the father is the process of castration, right? And this is what we're working with in analysis from a psychoanalytic perspective. I would say from an orthodox perspective, castration is when the ego, the identity, ego small e, is instantiated into the world. So to sacrifice one's castration is to sacrifice one's identity, the old man, right? From an orthodox perspective. I think there's a lot of interesting correlates here, but let's continue. This loss from castration is imposed in a sense, but the child also adopts a position with respect to the parents' demands regarding that loss. For certain children, continue to suck their thumbs and or touch their genitals in private, in defiance of their parents' demands. In other words, they refuse to give up this satisfaction completely. Others do not give it up altogether for a variety of reasons. They may do so, as Freud tells us, because of very blatant castration threats uttered by their parents. A number of my analysts, so Bruce Fink is a practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst. So in analysis, you have the analyst and the analysand. The analysand is just what we would think from a American perspective as the patient in psychiatric or psychoanalytic care. So again, they may do so, as Freud tells us, because of the very blatant castration threats uttered by their parents. A number of my analysants, he says, have convinced me that such threats still occur in our day and age, especially in lower and lower middle class milieus. In the case of little boys, out of fear of losing forever the pleasurable sensations derived from their genitals, which I would argue is the beginning of the temptation rooted in the passions, right? They give up autoerotic pleasure for fear of losing all genital pleasure, or because they fear losing their parents' love and esteem. This loss of satisfaction or jouissance, which Lacan refers to as castration, is accepted to some extent by neurotics. They may not seem to have had much a choice in the matter, but their acceptance of it constitutes a solution to a problem presented by their parents, teachers, and other representatives of the social order. So again, as you can see here, this psychoanalytic perspective is constantly focused and juxtaposed on the ego, the individual, and the caretakers, the other, the law, society, school, work. But ultimately, this is the nucleus of this is the family, is the nuclear family. And the relationship between mommy, daddy, and me, right, this triad instantiated by the Oedipal complex and whatnot, is this fundamental unit that Lacan is working with here. And I think from an orthodox perspective, the fundamental unit, again, is the father. The mother is the nuclear family, and that's where the human melodrama plays out. All right, so the loss of satisfaction or jouissance, which Lacan refers to as castration, is accepted to some extent by neurotics. They may not seem to have much of a choice in the matter, but their acceptance of it constitutes a solution to the problem presented by their parents, teachers, and other representatives of the social order. Quote, if I give up this satisfaction, I get to keep something else. Nevertheless, the jouissance, thus sacrificed, is not so easily parted with at every level. The subject constitutes him or herself as a stance adopted with respect to that loss of jouissance. Another way you can think of jouissance, right, is it's the banishment from the garden in order to pursue desires, lower desires, which was a result of the fall, right? Adam and Eve, again, they were not born immortal or mortal. They were born in or brought into this world in a liminal state, and eventually were to become immortal as they spiritually matured. But they took it upon themselves to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, therefore giving them a lower resolution, lower slice understanding of desire and how it operates. So that's really tied into how identity is formed, I think, both here from a Lacanian perspective, but also from an Orthodox perspective. Nevertheless, the jouissance of the sacrificed is not easily parted with at every level. The subject constitutes him or herself, again, as a stance adopted with respect to the loss of jouissance. Object A, which is a term, the object cause of desire, that which we desire as human beings is not rooted in the qualities of the things in themselves that we think or it appears that we desire. We desire things, Lacan says, all desire is desire of the other. Right? So our desires are inextricably linked with the desire of our parents and then with the desire of the social world that we are born into. Object A can be understood as the object now lost, which provided that jouissance, that satisfaction, that enjoyment, as a kind of remainder of that lost jouissance. The pleasure given up seems all the more valuable now that it is lost. It seems we didn't know we had it so good. And as we saw in Chapter 1, the process of prohibition transforms the simple gratification or pleasure derived from autoerotic acts, for example, into jouissance. For the pleasure, when prohibited by the parents, takes on a further meaning, a meaning that involves the parents and the parents' desire. Quote-unquote naive, quote-unquote simple bodily pleasure is transformed into jouissance. This transformation, I would say, is a result of the fall and is a result of the spiritual immaturity of both the parents and the child, right? Because pleasure is not a bad thing, sex is not a bad thing, but its transformation into this jouissance, this fallen experience of desire at the center and the kernel of our identity, is a result of the split subject, the result of the splintered psyche, result of the fall. So the pleasure is transformed into jouissance, something far more erotic, dirty, bad, and evil, something really exciting, thanks to the prohibition. So it's, again, this idea of the rebellion, right? If you push your kids really hard not to do X, Y, or Z, they will inherently rebel and a lot of times will do X, Y, and Z. So he says, prohibition eroticizes. Prohibition eroticizes. Think of the initial prohibition from God in his commandment to Adam and Eve to not eat from the one commandment, to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That prohibition was transgressed, right? And in this process is where the machinations of the psyche really originate. So the stronger the prohibition, the more erotically charged the specific act prohibited becomes. The fundamental fantasy stage is the relationship between the subject and the lost object that provided this now prohibited satisfaction. Desire, as expressed in and propped up by the fundamental fantasy, is determined and conditioned by the satisfaction that has been prohibited and renounced. We see here why prohibition is so central to desire. It conditions desire, fixating it on that which is prohibited. Think about the idea, again, of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? That's when this fallen sense of desire was stirred in humanity. And our lives are constantly coming back to this tree of getting more knowledge, getting more status, getting more money, whatever it may be, attempting to satisfy something that necessarily cannot be satisfied through this process. And that's where, again, the neuroses and the psychological problems manifest there. We see here why prohibition is so central to desire. It conditions desire, fixating it on that which is prohibited. As Lacan says in Kant with Sade, law and repressed desire are one and the same. Law and repressed desire are one and the same. We also see the intimate relationship between desire and castration, qua loss of satisfaction. I desire precisely what I sacrificed, right? This really brought up the idea of Cain and Abel, right? All of history is an attempt and a failure to rectify, of course, the initial prohibition, but also what happened between Cain and Abel and the quality and the nature of Abel's sacrifice versus Cain's. And I think from a tangential perspective here, Lacan is going to hit right up on this. There's a case study that is expressed here, but I'm going to skip over here and get kind of towards the end. So it says, in analysis, terminable and interminable, Freud suggests that analysis, when carried out as far as it can go with neurotics, butts up against the rock of castration. So Freud suggested that analysis, when carried out far, butts up against, quote, the rock of castration, the bedrock beyond which analytic exploration is often unable to penetrate. Analysis can bring us to the point of discovering castration of the origins of our fallen identity, the sacrifice of satisfaction made at our parents' behest, but often can go no further. Right? So this is where the idea of, it's very similar in structure, if you think about it, the process of psychoanalysis when you go to a quote-unquote expert and you speak to them. And the idea of free association that Freud really kind of engendered, at least in its modern sensibility, there's no such thing as really free association. We are constantly embedded within a network of concepts, ideas, thoughts, desires. So when an analyst and a patient goes in for analysis and they're attempting free association, what comes up is not random. It might not be preordained, but what comes up is a window into the unconscious, and which gives us a little bit of a hint of what the kind of the central problem is from a psychoanalytic perspective. Whereas if you go to confession, right, I'd say that psychoanalysis is a lower resolution process of confession. Because when you go to confession, you're not being analyzed. If you find a real true spiritual father, you're there in communion, both sinners, and expressing your sins, free associating. That is where the healing happens. And we're seeing here that, at least here they're saying that there's this bedrock that analysis cannot get beyond, which is, it butts up to the fundamental fantasy, the fundamental idea of one's self, right? And in sacrificing this idea, it is sacrificing the intellect. It is crucifying the intellect. It is doing away with the old man for the new man to emerge from an orthodox perspective. To rephrase in Lacanian terms, the analysand, right, the patient, has handed over a certain jouissance, enjoyment, to the parental other, but never seems to stop regretting it. He or she remains stuck on that loss and refuses in his or her psychic economy to allow the other to enjoy what the subject has given up, to take advantage of the jouissance sacrificed. Now this, got to think, this is not a conscious process that is being articulated here. It can become conscious, but this is more from the unconscious, or the, the kind of the in-between. Quote, yes, I gave it up, but God forbid I should ever do anything you ask of me from now on. The neurotic may follow his or her parents' demands to a T. Marry, have children, follow the exact career choice they forced upon him or her, but never let the parents know that, quote, I did what you asked, but I'll never give you the satisfaction of knowing. Resentment is never relinquished. Again, that is one of the central themes of Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity. At the root of all sin is pride. And from pride is born resentment. And from a Lacanian perspective, he sees this resentment is never relinquished. Quote, my parents took something precious from me, but I fixed them good. I made them suffer for it, held it against them for decades, and never let them live it down. Close quote. Every neurosis entails such a resentful stance toward the other's satisfaction. The neurotic has made the sacrifice, but attempts to rip off compensatory satisfactions under the other's nose. Masturbating, stealing, cheating, speeding, breaking the law, and getting away with it, these are among the illicit satisfactions the neurotic is able to find, which, in his or her psychic economy, represents a taking back from the other, from the parents, from society, from the law, of the jouissance lost, of this lost enjoyment, this lost satisfaction, or a recompense, retribution, or indemnification by the other to the subject for the loss incurred. Neurotics claim against the other, for example, my parents didn't give me enough love, recognition, and approval, know no bounds. So the neurotics' claims against the other know no bounds. In terms of the term neurotic, quickly, we all have, kind of neuroses, right? But there's these three fundamental forms the psyche kind of organizes around from Lacan: the neurotic, the psychotic, and the perverse. But we're just going to deal here with the neurotic. But don't think think of yourself, right? Just like in terms of orthodoxy, do not look at the speck in your brother's eye when you have a log in your eye. Try to think through this as reflecting on your own experience. They gave up jouissance in the hope of receiving the other's esteem and got less than they bargained for. In Freudian terms, women never stop resenting their mothers for having deprived them of a penis. The love and esteem provided by way of compensation for the imaginary loss are considered inadequate. Men never overcome their castration anxiety in the face of what they perceive to be major life decisions and feel that regardless of what they do, they will never be able to satisfy their father's expectations, requirements, criteria, and ideals. So again, from the perspective of Cain and Abel, right? It seems like the resentment that Cain had for not bringing the appropriate sacrifice to God, right? Downstream of that, we have this idea of not living up to dad's expectations, requirements, criteria, and ideals. The approval their fathers provided is considered to have always been conditional upon achievement, and a man can never rest regardless of how much he achieves. According to Freud and many other analysts, psychoanalysis is not only rarely able to take the patient beyond the stance the neurotic's protest against castration, against the sacrifice made, is generally insurmountable and unsurpassable. Lacan, however, would beg to differ. His answer to what has been construed as the monolith bedrock of castration is the traversing of fantasy made possible by the confrontation with the analyst's desire. So in analysis, there is a transference where the analysand, the person in analysis, transfers his desire from the other to the analyst. And that is a process of transference. And then there's a counter-transference that happens as well. The analyst's interventions, including the scansion of the session, can lead to a new configuration of the analysand's, the patient's fundamental fantasy. So that is a metanoia, a reorientation from an orthodox perspective. I'm not saying that this is an orthodoxy. This is a metanoia as we understand it, as the fathers understand it. I'm saying that this is a low resolution analog or metaphor to what happens in the process of repentance and salvation, right? As a reorientation of the fundamental fantasy is a transformation and a reorganization, a transfiguration of the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And in doing so, this frees up the libidinal energy that's stuck in a sort of limbo state that causes the repetition, the compulsion repetition to continuously create and develop habits that are not good, and we know that they're not good. Could lead to a new configuration of the analysand's fundamental fantasy and thus to a new relation, stance, or position adopted with respect to the other. The mother, work, society. Again, the other is a fractal term here. The other's desire and the other's jouissance. The initial fixation of the analysand's desire is shaken up, and the analysand's desire is no longer serves as a substitute for a hindrance to the pursuit of satisfaction. So reorienting the perspective dislodges this hold of this pursuit of satisfaction, according to Lacan here. It should be noted that the fundamental fantasy is not so much something that exists per se prior to analysis as something constructed and reconstructed in the course of analysis. In a certain sense, it is distilled out of the whole network of fantasies that come to light in the course of analysis. Right? Fantasies, again, we can think of as idols, right? Idols. They're stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that are rooted in a false understanding of ourselves. So it can be seen after one's analysis has gone far enough that this is the position or stance the subject adopted with respect to the cause that has been responsible for so many of the subject's choices and actions. By the time such a position or stance has been discerned in analysis, it has no doubt already changed to some degree. The same is true of what Freud calls the primal scene. It is not so much a real scene witnessed by the child at a particular moment in time as a construction by the child, perhaps based on numerous scenes observed, overheard, and or imagined. That is the reconstructed and yet simultaneously transformed in the course of analysis. I'm going to read, there's one more little section here, which is separation from the analyst. Right? So psychoanalysis is a process and that should lead to a separation between the analysand, the patient, and the analyst. In orthodoxy, right, that's not the case because we're not going to be analyzed when you go to confession. You're continuously offloading, and if you're seriously repenting, your fallen desire, your sin, when you go to confession. So separation from the analyst. The ultimate struggle in analysis, that of getting the analysand, the patient, to assume responsibility for his or her castration, his or her identity, instead of demanding compensation from the other. So this is taking responsibility, right? Is played out between the analysand and the analyst who stands in for the other. So the analyst stands in for the mother, the father, the law, society, and for the lost object at the same time. The analysand, the patient, must be brought to the point where he or she no longer blames the analyst for his or her troubles and no longer seeks compensation or retribution. At the same time, the analysand, the patient, must faced with the analyst's constant desire for him or her to continue the analysis, reach a point at which the analyst's wishes have no longer a hold on him. If this is indeed the conjunction of forces operative at the end of analysis, and Freud and Lacan certainly seem to indicate that it is, then we should not be surprised to see analysis end with a kind of struggle or battle in which the analysand's attitude towards castration, identity, right, towards the jouissance sacrificed, towards our sin and our passion, changes, and the lost object is finally given up. The lost object is the knowledge of good and evil from a fallen perspective, I would say here. I'd have to think through that a little bit. It is given up not so much in resignation as in what Lacan refers to as a precipitation, a sudden reversal of things, a flip, a reconfiguration of the fundamental fantasy, metanoia. This is a psychoanalytic metaphor for metanoia, and I think it's coherent. I'd love to know what you think. The process is more likely to be messy, unwieldy, and hot to handle than to be cool, calm, and collected. As Freud says, quote, when all is said and done, it is impossible to destroy anyone in absentia or in effigy, and the object is no exception. The separation occurs in the present, and the stakes are very real. Finally here, I'm always a bit puzzled when I hear talk of analysands, patients, ending their analysis in a peaceful and friendly manner, and then hear of them befriending their analysts afterwards as if the choice of their former analyst as a friend were an indifferent choice, as if there were not enough other people in the world to befriend. Friendship is not in and of itself out of the question, assuming one has surpassed the stage of blaming the other for one's problems or one's fate. I mean, there you have it, right? The ultimate goal of Lacanian psychoanalysis, right, is to surpass the stage of blaming the other, of seeing the speck in your brother's eyes for one's problems and one's fate. But it suggests that a certain demand toward the other, a demand for recognition and approval, in short, for love, may well remain unresolved. Peaceful, quote-unquote, termination hardly seems consonant with the reversal of position regarding the onerous renunciation that is required to go beyond castration. So renunciation, right, metanoia, crucifying the intellect, is required to go beyond castration, to go beyond our fallen identity from a Lacanian perspective. So I hope you like that. I hope that was interesting. I would love to hear your feedback. Again, not looking to conflate these ideas, not looking to say, just putting them in dialogue and observing if there are fruits that manifest. And I think there are. What the consequences or what to do with these fruits or how to think through them from an Orthodox perspective or a Lacanian psychoanalysis perspective is, I'm not sure, but I think that will hopefully emerge as well. But wanted to keep this right at 30 minutes. Thank you if you're with me this long, God bless you. Thank you. And I'll see you guys next time.